Prior to Apple, I was working at Hewlett-Packard, and there started to be a slow migration of people from Hewlett-Packard over to Apple, and in particular, a good friend of mine went over there and told me that, hey, you ought to come check this out. And I thought, nah, I haven't been at HP all that long, and felt like, Apple was this little toy company and couldn't really be doing anything interesting. And then my former division manager, John Couch, had left HP and went to Apple, and he too kind of reached out to me and said, why don't you come take a look? And I thought, what's the harm in actually going over and seeing what's up? And once I did, I was given a demonstration of something I had never seen before. Basically, there was a CRT, this tube, a bunch of wires coming out of it, sitting on a plywood sort of stand, and somebody put their hand on a little sharp-edged lucite box that had 3 buttons on it and had a cord sort of attached back to that device. And when they moved that little box on the table, something moved on the screen. And that was the first time I'd seen anything like that. Right then it just clicked in my head that this was a game changer. This was going to be the future of computing. And just that quick little demo convinced me immediately it was a place I wanted to be and something I wanted to be part of. Yeah, I think I first started hearing about Apple in probably 79. I had moved to the Bay Area in 78 to start working for HP. In 79, I started to hear some chatter. And then after going to the company, and they had asked me to work on a project that was called the Filer at the time. They had already hired a reasonable sized team to work on other components of the system. Somebody to do the word processor, somebody to do the first spreadsheet. There was a small team to do a brand new operating system from scratch. They needed more people to work on the user interface. And so myself and one other person were tasked with doing this thing that was called the Filer, which was the main sort of interface to the system. Which is actually, it's the equivalent of, on the Macintosh, what they call the Finder, and on the Lisa they were calling it the Filer at the time.
Was there any time you knew, did you ever go see the Xerox Alto yourself, or see the Star, or any of the...
I didn't, and I wasn't even aware of it at all.
Okay.
It's interesting though, a friend, my coworker that had gone over ahead of me was actually hired to go over there and, of all things, port the Smalltalk system onto the Lisa. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it was a very early system that had overlapping windows and used a mouse for control and stuff like that. It wasn't intended for consumers. It was a programming system. But so he had done that, and so I had some exposure seeing that. But I had no idea of what this Xerox Star was, or the fact that Xerox was doing a product like that, until the product was actually announced. Now there were some people at Apple, obviously, that knew about this because they had come from Xerox, so they knew a little bit. But I think they felt that they needed, to keep it confidential and not talk about it and not share those sort of ideas and concepts at Apple. So most of us knew nothing about it. One of the things that drew me to this project, aside from just seeing the potential of having this new way to kind of interact, use basically a mouse and a bitmap display, was the shared passion for bringing computing to the masses. And that really was huge throughout the team. People really wanted to kind of rethink how people interacted with computers, and to try to take as much of the mystique out and try to make them as simple to use and as intuitive as possible. And so we pushed that really hard in many areas, and that was something that was had kind of been a passion of mine earlier anyway. And once I started there, it was only heightened, and spent more and more time trying to think about how can we make this thing more intuitive, especially for people that had never seen a computer before and never touched one. When I first started Apple, I was given an Apple II, and so I took that home and showed it to mom and dad and stuff like that, and it was all very mysterious and cryptic to people, and all the commands were entered by typing and stuff like that. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to teach people how to use a computer and what it meant and all these sort of things. And you could see there was a lot of confusion and what does this mean, and some fear about breaking things and all that sort of stuff. And so I had already had this kind of sense that that Lisa was going to make a huge difference, or had the opportunity to, if we could execute a human interface that was relatively straightforward and easy to use. And the interesting story behind all this is that, at least as far as that whole desktop management was concerned, it really started off on a different path. This is something documented in an article that myself and two others at Apple wrote. It's called Inventing the Lisa User Interface. It's an ACM article. And it goes back and it tells the history of this, which basically was we were going down a path that didn't have icons on the screen and direct manipulation for doing filing tasks and manipulation and stuff like that, and had actually pushed pretty far down that path before sort of at the last minute a few of us just felt like that really wasn't a direction that we felt was going to achieve the goal that we wanted for ease of use. And so we, in a little Skunk Works project at night, a few of us got together and prototyped what a user interface might look like with direct manipulation and the familiar icons and that we're all used to today. And then we sprung it on the team at some point near when we were supposed to ship the product, and begged for forgiveness and said, I think we were told, and people loved it, but said, we can't slip the schedule. So they said, as long as you can deliver this and stay on schedule, we'll go for it. And we did. So it was an interesting kind of twist to the whole story. There are things that we did on the Lisa project in terms of interacting with a computer to take the computer mystique out of the whole interaction that unfortunately were somewhat reversed when the Macintosh came out. And so those simplifications have to this day not come back, and it's sort of disappointing. And I thought it would be interesting just to talk about a couple of them.
Yes.
So one of the things that we did, this might resonate with you or others, which is we completely eliminated the whole idea of needing to save something. There was no such thing as saving a document, or you could never. The concept that something could just mysteriously disappear, doesn't occur in the natural world, and we were trying to mimic the natural world as much as possible. It was supposed to be paper and familiar objects, and so anything you created was there. You never had to say save, and the only way anything could ever go away was if you consciously took it and threw it in the trash can, and then of course even then you could pull it out. But when the Macintosh came back for a variety of reasons, I think partly it was they had some really tough hardware constraints. And that's really what we were trying to do. We were trying to make it as sort of intuitive and as familiar as possible. So you never had to save. The context of everything was always remembered.
You're shutting down the computer.
Shutting down the computer. You just press the button, and I did this. I made this little animation. All the little documents all run back into their little folders, and everything goes back in, and then it turns off. And then when you turn it back on, everything comes back out and is back on your desk in exactly the same state as it was before. And so that was very conscious, something that we wanted to do to keep the thing to be more familiar. And there are a handful of other little things like that where, again, we've sort of gone, I don't say I haven't gone backwards, but we haven't caught back up to where I think the Lisa was.
Yes.
So another example of something that we did that it got lost in the Macintosh and hasn't come back was the remembrance of where things sort of came from. So when you were working on a document and you took it out and you put it on your desktop to work on it and stuff like that, we had the notion of, and there was actually a command, a menu to put it away when I'm done, and it would remember where it was, what folder it was, and it would go right back in there. And so that was something that made it very easy to kind of keep things in a tidy state and stuff like that. Another one was there wasn't the idea of creating a new document wasn't a mysterious sort of thing where you had to hunt and find a create thing. We had these little stationery pads that were of different types that represented the kind of thing that you were trying to do. So if you were going to write a document, you got a piece of writing paper. If you were going to do a spreadsheets, calculations, you got a spreadsheet paper and stuff like that. And we did a little animation where a little piece would come off, peel off of the stationery pad and come over and open up and stuff like that. So there, again, the idea was to try to stick with the familiar as much as possible and make it clear to people, I think, sort of what was going on without the mystique of a lot of the computer jargon. So, there's a handful of things like that. And then a lot of other little simple touches, like another thing that I remember implementing specifically, but to this day it hasn't been implemented on the Mac, I'm not sure why, was I made it impossible for you on your desktop to have things obscured by other things. Like today on the Macintosh, you can have a lot of things sitting on top of each other, icons and stuff like that, and so I made them kind of slippery. So when you tried to put another document set it on top of another one, it would just kind of slide off into some place where it was kind of open, kind of as close as nearby. But so you never ended up with this lost thing. Now that one, you could say, well, what do you mean? That's not real life. In real life, of course, I can hide things and stuff. But we tried to, again, we didn't want to try to implement all of the difficult things in real life as well. We wanted to try to, where possible, make it a little bit easier for you. And that's an example. Once I saw these couple of little demo programs that that had been developed for this kind of early prototype of the Lisa, and saw that you could do, what's now referred to as direct manipulation, where you could make a little hand or something show up on the screen, and pushing a button was the equivalent of closing your hand on something, and then you could move this device and it would move the thing on the screen. To me, and I assume, obviously the original creators of the whole that whole paradigm, realized that just opened the door to mimicking reality in lots of different ways and in lots of different applications, right? And trying to do things in the same physical nature. And so, making the leap from that to doing something that was similar to an office environment was not that difficult. And in fact, we had prototyped things that were far beyond this. We actually had at one point we had a physical desk sitting on the screen, and your familiar little desktop, there's like a little clock sitting on your desk and various things, and there was a big file cabinet over here. I mean, we played with prototyped a lot of those sort of ideas, and it was really came down to the balance of trying to replicate the physical world, the real world for office workers, but at the same time not recreating all the things that maybe aren't good about the real world or make it more difficult or are not completely necessary. So that's the thing. We just tried to find the balance between those two, and there were, I think you could argue that you could go maybe more or less, one way or another. But anyway, that's the balance that we ended up striking. Yeah, what I was saying is that the target market for the Lisa when it came out was for office workers. That was its intent. It wasn't intended to be just a personal computer. And office workers were thought to have had, particular needs, right? Beyond just creating the different types of documents. One of the things that was stressed a lot was that a lot of times people in the office world tend to get interrupted a lot, and so they need to be able to quickly multitask and switch from this to that, and so that influenced a lot of things that we did in the design of this in terms of allowing you to be able to quickly switch between applications, to always save the state of everything, automatically for you. And when you came back to something, things were exactly the way it was when you left off, and those sorts of things. So those were kind of sort of important driving goals kind of in the development of the product. But it is true that, this, Xerox did come out with this Xerox Star product before we released. We had already made the decision to go down this path of what the user interface was going to be like before that came out. But for sure it had the feeling that okay, that's yet another thing Apple was trying to kind of copy from another company, and that really wasn't the case. It was very clear that it was similar target. I mean, it was for office workers for sure.
I think it was like in '81. I think it was like $38,000.
It was, but a much higher end and much more, much pricier. But yeah, it was trying to get. Anyways, it's intended to be for business users for sure. There was a set of functions that needed to be enabled. You needed to be able to,
like a to-do list more than a.
Yeah, a set of requirements. You need to be able to create a document. You need to be able to file it away someplace. You need to be able to rename it. You need to be able to move it from this location to that location. You need to be able to find it if you put it someplace and you can't remember where it was. So the list of requirements, but there wasn't. I don't believe there certainly wasn't a user interface description of what we ended up with. That did not exist at all. There might have been something that guided us to the first implementation, which was referred to in kind of a joking way as the 20 questions filer, they called it, because any operation that you needed to do sort of involved going to a menu, choosing that item, and then typically a dialogue, what we call a dialogue box, would pop up. It would ask you some sort of question. What would you like to do today? Where are you? Are you trying to move this? Or you want to rename it? What do you want to do? And you'd go another level. Or the find thing in particular was kind of like a browser. You would say, well, or when you went to put something away, which cabinet do you want to put it into? Oh, I want to put it in this cabinet. Okay, which file folder do you want to put it in? Oh, I think I'll put it in this one. But it was all, came at you almost sort of like a set of questions. And so that's why I got that, kind of funny nickname, 20 Questions Filer. So there might have been something like that was lying around kind of when I started, because that was definitely the initial path sort of that we went down. And I was charged with implementing it, and that was what I was doing. And, at some point, a number of us, myself in particular, just saying, guys, I don't feel like we're achieving our goals of usability with this interface. Let's think about something else. Yeah, I think what was there was the idea that there were going to be overlapping windows was certainly there, and the idea that there would be applications of a certain sort, like I said, a word processor and a spreadsheet and a drawing program and all those, and some kind of rough ideas of what the interfaces would be. But there were a lot of things that were but in terms of how you kind of manage the filing of all of this and all the kind of the details behind the files, which we never really talked about, that hadn't really been defined. And actually, right before I got there, I just heard about it, and so there were still some, lingering disagreements. There was a lot of issues even about how many buttons are going to be on the mouse. Is it going to be 3 buttons? Is it going to be 2 buttons? Is it going to be 1 button? And so that, I think, rolled around quite a bit before they, finally settled on a single button, and we drove everything from there. Yeah, a lot of the earlier devices had multiple buttons. Non-Apple devices, and the thought was that you really needed that. And so a lot of work went into that part of the interface to show that, you really don't for the majority of uses. Yeah, I think that there really is sort of no substitute for usability testing. You put your best thoughts into trying to make something easy to use and as simple as possible by thinking about it yourself, but until you really get it in front of people that aren't living with this thing every day like you are, you don't really know if you've hit the mark or not. And we certainly had a number of surprises. One story that I think Bill Atkinson likes to tell a lot is the story of the dialog box. It would pop up, which is a way of kind of interacting with the computer where it needs to get more information. You choose something and it puts up a little window and it gives you some information, and typically there's like 2 buttons there. One of them is cancel, and the other one is this sort of go ahead and do it operation. That's what it's intended for. And so we had actually labeled the buttons just that. We had cancel, and the other one was do it. And maybe it was because of the font that we were using in those days or whatever, but a number of people saw that second button, and instead of reading do it, they saw dolt. And they said, what is dolt? I have no idea what dolt is. And so we changed it to okay. And so that was one of the things that we learned, and we had no clue. For us, it was obvious, do it, and do the operation. And I think, I have to think about it a little bit more, but even to this day, when I am developing consumer products, I'm surprised sometimes at, the way that people interact with those products. Not exactly what we expected when we designed it. The interesting thing about the Lisa product, if you think about it, is that what it was attempting to do from a functionality point of view, given the state of computer hardware at the time, was somewhat astounding and really sort of beyond what you could expect. And I say that because the hardware that was used was so primitive compared to what's available today, and yet this machine had all these functions that were, kind of very similar to, sort of modern computing, and in particular the notion of having several programs all running at the same time, and then you could switch back and forth between them, and all this overlapping windows, and quality graphics for its time. All those things were required a significant amount of programming to do them, and all of this had to be jammed into, eventually it was only 1 megabyte of memory that the thing ran on. And not only that, it was originally supposed to all run off of floppy disks, if you can believe that. Now eventually they had to change that because they realized it was impossible and had a hard drive and stuff. But so in some ways the vision for the software far exceeded the hardware, and in particular the price point of the hardware. And I think that's really what contributed to it not being a financial success. I mean, if you had turned any one of those dials, either it was going to be far less functional, then you could have had less hardware and had a lower price, and I think it had an opportunity to be a little bit more successful. Or if you had if you were able to fully outfit it with kind of more expensive hardware, then it could have been even more capable. But I don't know, I think in some ways it was a little bit ahead of its time relative to the hardware, and so that happens a lot in consumer products. And it's very often the case that the first version that shows something is really cool isn't quite good enough to be a market success, and that was definitely the case with the Lisa. Well, it's true. Our ideas often, throughout the history of computing, and I guess just man's endeavor in general, often are beyond the state of the technology. So I'll give you another example. Immediately after we shipped the Lisa, a few of us kind of helped out with the Macintosh for a while, but beyond then, after that, myself, Bill Atkinson, and Rick Myers, another colleague of ours, we all started to do a Skunk Works project out of Bill's basement to do, this is 1984, remember, to do the first tablet computer, like the equivalent to an iPad. And so we were doing mock-ups, we were doing prototype software. Bill was working on, this one was going to actually have handwriting recognition and stuff, so you could actually write on it and stuff like that. And we probably spent 6 months kind of going down that path before we realized, the hardware just isn't ready to support something like this. And there were some other pressing needs. We got pulled off to do other things. But I think a lot of times, well, and actually if you think of the history of handheld computing itself, there were a lot of little handhelds in the early days. There were little Casio things and stuff that were really not very good and not very useful until finally Palm came on the scene, who I ended up working for and ended up running all of the software for Palm, came up with the magic to actually make a useful handheld device. And then obviously later with, when the iPhone came out, it just changed everything. But, people have these ideas, before it's possible to implement them in a cost-effective way that consumers can buy. And I think that was definitely the case for the Lisa. like any development project, a number of kind of fun things or funny things sort of happen along the way. A couple that sort of stick out for me. One is that in those days, just as it is today with Apple, there was a lot of secrecy around what was being done, and so you couldn't tell anybody about what you were working on or show anybody anything. And there was this just big concern that if anything leaked out, competitors would get the jump on you. So when I was working on the Filer or Desktop Manager, I had a notebook that I maintained of the source code. In those days, we would print things out on paper, and lots of screenshots of the different parts of the user interface, ideas that we're working on, as well as the technical documentation about how the thing worked. But a lot of it showed, what Steve Jobs would consider, the real secrets of kind of what we were trying to do in terms of the secret sauce, with this kind of graphical user interface. So much like maybe it even still goes on at Apple today, we working, crazy, insane hours. And I remember one night in particular, I was doing a particularly long shift, and I think straddled out of the building at about 2 a.m., after, trying to, finish something up, and took my notebook and stuff with me, which I would typically do because I would work at home as well. And I think that I was leaving at the same time as somebody else. We got into a quick conversation or something, and I put my notebook up on the top of the car while I was talking to him, and then after we finished, got into the car and drove home, leaving that notebook up there with all of the, Apple secrets, on the top of my car. When I woke up the next morning, searching around for the notebook, I couldn't find it. And I'm like, boy, what could have happened to that thing? So I drive all the way back into work, and I discover that all up and down Sunnyvale-Saratoga Road, which is the main road right in front of the Apple campus, what was their headquarters, and right where there's a row of buildings that Apple had where we were developing it. All along that road and in the center divider were all these pages from this notebook, screenshots, documentation, source code, just littered all up and down the street. And so I'm like, oh my God, this is the worst possible thing. I'm getting fired for sure, stuff like that. So I, jumped out of my car, and I'm running up and down, the street, trying to pick up all these stuff, and people are giving me the thumbs up for cleaning up the litter, on the street. Thinking, that's so nice of that young man to take an interest in our city here. Really, obviously, I was trying to, keep these secrets from going elsewhere and retain my job. But I had managed to, I think, find just about everything, and nobody ever knew about it. And it was, the biggest gaffe of my career, probably. It could have been pretty disastrous.
Lucky, overnight, that it thankfully didn't rain.
Exactly. Yeah.
It might have been better if it rained. Well, not
and
really,
it wasn't too windy, and they didn't blow all over the place. But yes, I had left the sort of the crown jewels all up and down the street. Yeah, a little bit.
Did he seem like? Do you remember him in times when he was like really jazzed over the Lisa? And I know there's pictures of him. He's
and hypercritical. I mean, he'd tell you, you're an idiot, or that sucks, or fix this or fix that. So he would come around and kind of render his opinion and stuff like that. And
so you remember him being like generally happy with, like, you felt like he was happy with your work, and I think generally, he wanted to. That was his baby, was the Lisa, and then when he was forcibly removed for it is when he started the Macintosh project. But so yeah, he was definitely behind it. I do remember one time when I first started there, we were working in a building on Sunnyvale-Saratoga Road there that kind of looked like a giant Taco Bell, and so we called it Taco Towers. And we were in cubicles, and I was sitting in my little cubicle, and I had a prototype Lisa sitting there, and next to it was an Apple II with a stack of floppy drives, because we were actually writing the software for the Lisa on an Apple II, if you can believe that. It's pretty primitive initially. And this device that was sitting on my desk, the prototype Lisa, was, as I described before, was just basically some plywood and a CRT all exposed, and wire wrap boards and stuff like that. And Steve walked by one time and kind of threw a fit. He says, do you know if you touch this right here, you could electrocute yourself? And so immediately everybody, the hardware guys came and made some like little cardboard hood or something to put around it and stuff like that. But he would pay attention to those kinds of things. And so he would wander around from time to time.
I thought you were going to say everybody maybe went, duh.
Yeah. Watch me do that. Yeah, it was actually a good friend of mine, Jeff Parrish, was the engineer who took on that task of writing the underlying software to allow the Lisa to run all the Mac software. And we were all for it. We thought that was cool that you could do that, and it made sense to have that as another offering. But it's pretty clear to everybody that it didn't make sense for Apple to offer both of these products because they were similar but not the same. The Lisa operated a little bit differently than the Mac, and so it. And then obviously with the price point it ended up at, it was not selling and stuff like that. Although the same actually could be true for the Mac as well. The Mac came out quite a bit higher price than what was originally expected as well, and that was a barrier for a lot of people also.
Yeah.
It did take a while, and actually, again, it was sort of like the Lisa, parts of the hardware and technology needed to advance before it really became, it became fun to use and kind of reasonable to use. In particular, getting a hard disk. Remember, everything's run off of floppies, which are painfully slow, and you're constantly switching them back and forth. So that, and then getting more memory and stuff like that, so you could, either run more, bigger programs, or you didn't have to switch the disks and stuff. So it really took, and frankly, that's why. Even though I've done lots and lots of first generation products and love making them, I like being on the cutting edge and have done it in lots of other areas as well. As a consumer, I almost never buy a first generation of anything because I know it's going to be pushing the boundaries. It's kind of like a proof of concept that, okay, yeah, we can do this, but it's really not quite as, the ideal experience and as nice to use as it could be. So, and I think that was the case for both the Lisa and the Macintosh when they first came out. Yeah, obviously you put years and years into the development of a product, and then the crazy thing is, from a technical perspective, you don't have to do this today, but in those days we had to do everything. Not only was the hardware brand new, but every piece of the software we had to write, from the base level operating system. There was no Android or iOS or Mac, or any of these things existed, right? So we had the full operating system. All the graphics routines and everything had to be created from scratch. Every one of those applications had to be written from scratch. So just tons and tons of development work, which is why this was I guess I started in 80, and the project had been already going on for at least a year before that, and then didn't ship till 83. So, it was a 4 to 5 year effort to build this thing. You put that much time and energy, heart and soul, and we really were working just
crazy hours. Yeah, when it doesn't become the big, commercial success, yeah, part of you just sort of like, just feels, pretty bad about it. And especially when you think that, if the thing had, continued to be supported for a few more years, took advantage of the, Moore's law, the doubling of processing power and more memory and the prices coming down and stuff like that, the thing, potentially could have been a commercial success, right? But since we had this, parallel activity with the Macintosh coming, into play, it made more sense to go with that. Even though, in a lot of ways, as I said before, it was a big step backwards. You could only run a single program at a time on the Macintosh. Whereas Lisa did everything, right? And all those other things I talked about before, the saveless model and, all that sort of stuff, wasn't implemented when the Macintosh first came out. So yeah, it felt like a big step backwards. On the other hand, it was a quarter of the price, and it was small and portable and cute. And of course, I lugged one home and showed it to mom and dad, and anybody I could meet, I would teach them how to use a computer for the first time. Myself personally, but a few of the people, kind of transitioned over to help work on the Mac. Bill Atkinson being the biggest contributor for sure, and his heart was in and all of our hearts are sort of in both products, and there's a little competition, of course, and a little bit of ours is better than yours, that sort of thing, but for the most part, people wanted both products to succeed, but from a business sense, it sort of became pretty clear one of them sort of needed to go away. Apple was a pretty crazy place back then. Maybe it still is. I don't know. In terms of the politics that are going on behind the scenes, and what people sort of the tribalism that sort of naturally occurred, and our tribe is better than your tribe, and all that sort of that just naturally happens. So yeah, that happens, and so sometimes the person that went back and forth was like, well, whose side are you on? Well, I'm on nobody's side. Not a big deal, but I think generally the people that really cared about the company and stuff were just trying to do the right thing for the company and to try to keep make one of these products successful.
And so it'd be fair maybe to class, or call, obviously for the company, to ultimately be profitable, but like it was a mission.
It really
so
was.
The Macintosh was still delivering on that mission.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
on those goals.
It's a really good point. The goals of the Lisa were very much aligned with the goals of the Mac, and vice versa. The biggest difference really was, whereas the Lisa was really intended to be for business users, the Mac was always thought of as being a personal computer. I'm going to have one of these in my home. But the whole idea of let's make this thing super simple to use, a non-computer geek could actually come up to this thing and use it. Those goals were the same for both teams, and people pushed hard to try to achieve those. It was a little more challenging on the Mac because it originally had like a quarter of the memory, and it was just so technically difficult to create that functionality on such a less capable hardware platform. These guys really worked their tails off. Whereas on the Lisa side, most of us were writing in a higher level programming language, which happened to be Pascal at the time. I don't think there's any commercial software that's written in Pascal these days, but that's what we wrote it in. On the Mac, some of the development was done in Pascal, but a lot of kind of the core functionality had to be done in assembly language, which is extremely low level and tedious and cumbersome. And the whole reason was it had to be as small as possible and as efficient as possible to fit into the tiny memory constraints of the Macintosh. So there's some real technical challenges for both teams, just given the state of the hardware at the time. like a lot of organizations where there's a lot of passion and people are working crazy hours together and stuff, we also try to have some fun along the way. And the Lisa team, engineers in particular, would have late night activities, shall we say, within the office buildings. And there are a couple of things that I remember specifically that we did. One was there were wars of various sorts in the cubicles where people would shoot projectiles at each other. In those cases, there was one was a rubber band war where it turns out one of the guys knew the technique, which I remember to this day, for doing highly accurate rubber band shooting with your fingers. I mean, typically the rubber band goes off like that, but there's a technique that you can use. So we'd have lots of, rubber band wars until one of the, senior managers got hit in the head accidentally, and that kind of put an end to that. But they also had these late night paper dart wars. They made these PVC pipes and kind of rolled up kind of cone-shaped darts, and we'd run around having darts that you would shoot, and then I think there was some sort of equalizer in there where if you won the round, you had to take a shot of whiskey or something like that to make you less effective in the next round and stuff like that. So a lot of fun and stuff like that was had on a kind of regular basis. So it was a good group. It was a fun time.